All right. All right. We are coming live from City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. This is a segment we call Rockford Reading. The book that we are reading today is In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweil. I think this, if anybody's tuning in, if it's any audio issues, please just give me say something in the comments. Let me know if we got any audio issues. We've been having some audio issues with different things we've been doing here these past couple days. So for anybody who has never tuned in to our Rockford Reading segment, I'll do a short rundown on what it is we do. We pick a piece of literature and we read through it. And in the midst of us reading through it on live, we speak about how the issues that are being presented in the book correlate to issues that we are currently facing in Rockford, Illinois, in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. We have read multiple books in the process of doing this. We encourage people to purchase these books online via audiobooks or purchase these books in stores and to read along. One of the things that we emphasize is that for us it's not about reading the book to be able to say we read the book or reading the book as some type of accomplishment, but it's about reading the book and actually taking the information that is in here and having a critical conversation, a critical dialogue, critical monologue about how the information presented in this book can assist us in the things that we're facing today, whether that be ideologically, tactically, or just historical wise, getting a deeper understanding of the history of this city. The history of this nation, and then correlating that with the history of the city. So we're on chapter 2 of In Defense of Looting. This chapter is called Looting Emancipation. I'm going to, I don't know, it's looking like it might rain. I don't know, half the sky look like it want to rain, half the sky look like it's going to be beautiful. So if it starts raining, I will end this live and then come back to it at a different time. But for now, the plan is to read as long as I have it within me to read. So let's begin. Again, we are on chapter 2 of In Defense of Looting. This chapter is entitled Looting Emancipation. This is written by Vicky Osterweil. Been a very good read so far. I encourage people who, after this, if you haven't seen some of the other ones, listen to the other ones, go back and listen to them. Okay, let's continue. Fugitives on the eve of the Civil War were drawing on a tradition of revolt and resistance that was hundreds of years old. Across the Americas, throughout the centuries, the sleep of white plantation owners, merchants, and governors was made fitful by the nightmare of slave revolt. The enslaved, armed with guns, hoes, and scythes. Oh, wait, I think I read through this already. I did read through this already, but we're going to keep going. The enslaved, armed with guns, hoes, and scythes, flaming torches, and unimpeachable vengeance, marched unceasingly across their unconscious. As the years progressed, these dreams took on a less spectral and more nameable shape. Toussaint L'Ouverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel, Haiti, Bahia, Stono, Amistad. Violent insurrections were only the most spectacular form of resistance. Poisoning enslavers, their kin, and their livestock, sabotaging equipment, and burning buildings to the ground were common night terrors of the enslaver. Suicide was also a common, tragic form of struggle against the slave regime. Less dramatic, more everyday resistances abounded. Working slowly and inexpertly, pretending ignorance or incomprehension, despite the widespread use of the hoe in African agriculture, oversleeping, and other ways of rejecting the enslaver's labor regime and lowering his profits were practiced wherever Africans went enslaved. The most reliable form of resistance was flight. The very first known enslaved Africans in what would become the United States, kidnapped and brought to a small Spanish colony in the area of the Carolinas around 1526, revolted, escaped their bondage, and lived out their lives among indigenous tribes. Flight was not always permanent. The record is full of the enslaved leaving only to visit family members and friends on nearby plantations, to attend social events and religious gatherings, or sometimes to strike, refusing to return to the plantation until demands were met. In the early colonial days of what would become the United States, Those who escaped permanently fled to indigenous tribes to the uncolonized west or to the sparsely colonized Spanish territory of Florida to the south. These fugitives also formed or joined secretive communities of escaped slaves in the swamps and hills around the plantations. Although maroonage is a more historiographically centered phenomenon in Brazil, Suriname, and the West Indies, for example, in Jamaica, where maroon communities fought famous guerrilla wars with the colonizers, it was still considerably practiced in the United States. Okay, give me 1 second here. I just want to share this. If anybody's watching this, please share this Rockford reading. Again, we are doing the Rockford reading of In Defense of Looting. What's up? What's up? What's up? We're doing the Rockford reading of In Defense of Looting. So anybody that's watching this, please share this. I'm just gonna share it real quick on my Facebook page, and then we're gonna dive back into the reading. Let me make sure the volume right. Okay, yeah. Okay, volume good. All right, sharing this on my page. Watch and share. If you watching this, even if you're watching it and it's not live anymore, still go ahead and take a moment to share it. Sorry, I hate to interrupt the flow like this. Share to my story. Okay. All right. That's my due diligence. Make sure the audio's right. Make sure I share it. Okay, let's keep reading. During the colonial period, European, African, and indigenous enslaved and indentured peoples escaped the plantation together to form maroon communities, with European maroons conveniently able to pass as legal citizens and thus trade with the colonies on behalf of the larger settlement. Particularly large communities formed in the mid-Atlantic Great Dismal Swamp and across more sparsely colonized Florida. The maybe 6,000 square mile Great Dismal Swamp, running through the borderlands of North Carolina and Virginia, was a known free and hostile community in the center of slavery's heartland. Maroons from the Dismal Swamp sent units to serve alongside the British in the Revolutionary War, and during, quote, peacetime, end quote, they went on looting raids out into the surrounding slave country, stealing supplies and freeing the enslaved. In doing so, they developed guerrilla tactics that would help them to free thousands during the Civil War. In Florida, between 1817 and 1858, the federal government waged 4 decades of war to uproot the powerful, autonomous Seminole communities made up of African Maroons and Creek Indians. These communities often sent looting raids into Virginia, Alabama, and Georgia to free family members and comrades, and their settlements were the destination of many fugitives from the Deep South. Remembered in history as the Seminole Wars, the federal government's military campaign against them, which lasted for almost the entire antebellum period, started as slave-catching expeditions. The so-called Second Seminole War, from 1835 to 1842, included the largest slave rebellion in American history outside of the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. The role of the Maroons in this war has been mostly left out of standard histories, but at least 400 enslaved people looted themselves from Florida plantations to join the Seminoles in fighting the U.S. government. A government terrified by indigenous and black solidarity waged the Seminole Wars, and these conflicts represent an important moment in the long tradition of armed self-defense in both insurgent communities. It is a tradition that liberal historians often try to explain away, but armed self-defense against the white supremacist state has always been a crucial part of movements for liberation. Despite some victories, these protracted wars, at great cost to the U.S. government in lives and money, eventually saw most of the Seminoles killed or forced to migrate to Oklahoma, Texas, or Mexico. Though the Seminoles were never fully defeated, these campaigns, along with the concomitant growth of plantations and white populations in U.S. American Florida, meant that as the 19th century wore on, Florida became a less viable destination for fugitives. So, instead, many captives stole themselves north. Okay, and then that's not the end of the chapter, but there is a break in the reading right here. It's like 3 matches, which seems to be, like a changing of the topic a little bit. I guess what I want to speak about there is, first I want to look up the definition of a word. This is one of the things that we've been trying to, and I should have the laptop out so it'll be a little bit easier. But this is one of the things we've been trying to do more often is look up the definition of the words as we're reading through this. when we encounter a word we don't know the definition of, because that is in my opinion, the best way and the proper way to read is as you're reading through something, have a dictionary or Google or something at your side, so that way when you run into words that you don't know the definition of, you can look them up to give you a more thorough reading. So I'm looking at the definition of concomitant. The sentence it was used in was, though the Seminoles were never fully defeated, these campaigns, along with the concomitant growth of plantations and white populations in U.S. American Florida, meant that as the 19th century wore on, Florida became a less viable destination for fugitives. So I would think that means some type of quick growth, the concomitant growth of plantations. Let's see. Concomitant. All right, concomitant definition. I think I'm enunciating that right. Let's see if I find it. Let's hear how it's supposed to be said.
Concomitant.
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 Okay, concomitant. Adjective. Naturally accompanying or associated with a phenomenon that naturally accompanies or follows something. Though the Seminoles were never fully defeated, these campaigns, along with the concomitant growth of plantations and white populations in U.S. American Florida, okay, so that makes sense. It's just the growth that is along with. Okay, I think one of the things I want to point out about the section we just read is I'm uneducated and uninformed about the Seminole Wars. Also, this has been one of the first books that we have read out here that dates back to slavery and touches back to slavery. Besides, we also read Cast, which sort of did that, but I didn't have a heavy amount of reading load in Cast. And so for me, this is one of the first books that I'm reading while out here that touches back heavily on slave times and chattel slavery and some of the things that were going on during that time. And I think one of the main things, again, that I'm getting out of this is just hearing more about the struggle against slavery that was taking place, hearing more about the struggle against colonization that was taking place. And I think that is something that is purposefully, and I sort of touched on this on prior readings, is purposefully left out of American literature and American text and American education. I think they would rather have this false telling of the indigenous people and the black people of this and the Africans that were brought over here just sort of being fully victims and never fighting or never struggling against what it was that was coming down upon them. And I think that this does a good job of illustrating just how uncomplicit that they were with it, how little they did just comply with slavery and with colonization. And so, and it's also doing a very good job, in my opinion, of continuing to illustrate the fact that since black people and since slaves were seen as property, that the escaping of those people was a form of looting property. And so it just continues to, this book, so far it is continuing to just give you the historical precedent for looting in this nation, for whether at this point it's the looting of black bodies that's being spoken of heavily, but in other portions they spoke of the looting that came along with the slavery. Whether it be the looting of resources that would happen in the midst of slave rebellions, or other items. And so those are just some of the thoughts that I got from that portion that we read. Let's continue. Thanks to the centering of the Civil War in our study of the history of slavery and the telling of that history predominantly by the liberal white descendants of the Union, who like to pretend that white supremacy is a Southern condition, slavery is often wiped from the history of the Northern colonies. But black and indigenous captives of the Dutch built the first European settlements on the island of Manhattan. Rhode Island was home to the two largest and most important colonial slave markets of the 18th century, and people were auctioned on the market squares and advertised in the newspapers of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And so this is something that is, again, new to me. I've never heard about this before, but I think this is important in the concept of just how widespread racism and racial injustice are in this nation, and how even when it may have been times where the North was not displaying it in the same manners of the South, the North has still benefited from it. What up? Be safe out here, bro. It's good seeing you. They may not have benefited, they may not have displayed that racism in the same manner of the South, but they benefited from it equally to the South, just in different, aspects, in different manners. And so to hear about Malcolm, this was a saying I got from Malcolm X, or a thing I first heard from Malcolm X, and has stuck with me ever since. He was giving a speech, and he said, don't talk about the South. Don't talk about the racists in the South, or the South like the South is the only place that's racist. As long as you below the Canadian border, you in the South. Talk about the North as well as the South. The North is just as racist as the South. It just looks different. In the South they're wolves, and in the North they're foxes. And so that's something that has always stuck with me. So reading about how the black and indigenous captives of the Dutch built the first European settlements on the island of Manhattan, that's informative, and it goes again to this idea that as long as you're below the Canadian border, you're in the South. That the whole America as a whole has benefited again from slavery, and from the fruits of slavery. When it speaks about Rhode Island being home to the two largest and most important colonial slave markets of the 18th century, that's something I had never heard about or known. And again, it goes to further enlighten and further display just how widespread the evil of slavery was in this country. And then when it speaks about people being auctioned off in market squares and advertised in the newspapers of Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston, all places that American education and American literature and American doctrine would tell you had no type of connections to slavery, or had nothing to do with slavery. And so let's continue. The North's rocky soil and cold climate could not support large-scale cash crop plantation agriculture, though something resembling it emerged in the fertile coastal areas of Rhode Island, so the northern colonies never had nearly the same numbers of enslaved Africans living within them as did the South. But they still had slaves. And, as we've seen, the famous small farmer and independent merchant of New England, central to the story of the American Revolution, did most of his business with the slave colonies of the West Indies. New England often replaced Britain as the third point in the triangle trade. The North did not abolish slavery out of some liberality of spirit. Instead, it saw slavery mostly materially destroyed by fugitives in the years of the American Revolution. Early in the war, the British promised emancipation to any slaves who joined their cause. Eventually, seeing the incredible effectiveness of this promise, so did colonial forces. And I want to point out here that this goes to back to display the fact that the black life, the black body, has always been used as a political tool, has always been used as a political instrument as far back as Africans have been in this country. So even the concept of freedom, of liberty, of the right to pursue happiness has been something that has been a tactic used by the white power structures to gain political power, as opposed to being a human issue. It's been a political issue, as opposed to being something that was being granted, not even granted because you should be born with it, as opposed to being this change they were trying to do for humanity's sake. It was something that they were trying to do for power's sake, even as far back as the American Revolution and British giving people freedom, Britain giving people freedom, and then America, or what would become America, the colonies, following up on that. Hold on one second. Thanks, you too. You too, Miss Rebecca. Love you. Okay, let's continue with this. The North did not abolish. I'm gonna read through this again. The North did not abolish slavery out of some liberality of spirit. Instead, it saw slavery mostly materially destroyed by fugitives in the years of the American Revolution. Early in the war, the British promised emancipation to any slaves who joined their cause. Eventually, seeing the incredible effectiveness of this promise, so did colonial forces. Wherever the war went, the enslaved escaped behind its lines. But, as Russell Maroon Shoatz writes, though liberal historians, quote, are fond of reminding everyone that blacks provided over 5,000 fighters to the colonists' cause during that struggle, end quote, the enslaved favored the British, joining with them over the colonials at a rate of more than 10 to 1. At the war's end, some 10,000 black people fled the colonies with the defeated army they had fought alongside, leaving the United States on British ships. This does not mean that the British, still reaping massive profits from the slave trade and enslaving hundreds of thousands across their empire, had suddenly become the friends of the enslaved. The Crown's forces were merely the simplest and easiest vehicle of emancipation. Those who joined neither army fled otherwise. Tens of thousands used the confusion to flee to indigenous and maroon communities, if not to Florida, then to Canada. Perhaps 100,000, or 20% of the entire colonial enslaved population, escaped during the conflict. And because much of the fighting happened in the North, a much higher percentage of the enslaved in New England, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, though a smaller absolute number, made it to freedom. And so again here, we're sort of seeing this constant picking between the lesser of two evils that has always been the dilemma of the African in this nation, has always been the dilemma of the people of color in this nation is, and again, I sort of sometimes I like to speak on behalf of black people or behalf of the black community because of my experiences are more centered towards that. But I also don't want to be alienating communities, whether that be poor white communities, whether that be working class white communities, whether that be other communities of color that are in this nation that have dealt with some of these things. And so that is why I take the time to try to. He riding. Okay. My man's just riding. I don't even know if you're gonna be able to hear me over this. We're gonna chill. We're gonna let them get a green. They have a green here in a second. Okay, again, we are reading In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweil. We on chapter 2. Hold on one second. We on page 50. Okay, we outside. Those are the hazards of being outside. Okay, let's keep reading. Northern slavery, thus considerably reduced from its relatively small position, was legally abolished in the years following the Revolution, with the last state to formally do so, New Jersey, in 1804. And just for historical purposes, that's just 220 years ago, give or take, 215 years ago, give or take some months. So it was only 215 years ago that the last state in the North abolished slavery. So we have to do this, and this is something that I have to do a better job of doing. This whole entire, all the colonies allowed slavery, and allowed slavery to exist. And at different points in times in the existence of this nation, they have gotten rid of different forms of slavery. And so I think that that's something that I need to do a better job, even when I'm communicating, of not talking about slavery as if it was a thing that was only in the South and then got abolished in the South. It was a thing of the entire, all 13 colonies, the entire America, and it just was different portions in time in which it was removed from portions of the country. Okay, let's continue. And yet, even this economically safe, mostly after the fact, legal abolition was not carried out immediately and totally, but was rather instituted gradually and partially by state governments. The law that abolished slavery in New York, passed in 1799, protected enslavers such that slavery only actually ended in the state in 1827. There were still hundreds of legal slaves in Pennsylvania and New Jersey in the 1840s. Wow, so that takes it back to, now that goes to 1840, so that gives you 60 years to the 1900s, and then the 1900s through the 2000 will be 100 years, so 160. So in New Jersey, it's only been about 180 years since there were not legal slaves. In Pennsylvania and New Jersey, there's only been about 180 years since there were not legal slaves. My grandfather is 82 years old. I'm not sure how old his grandfather lived to be, but or his father lived to be. But if again, this is I just say that to say if you add these years up, these are 2 generations removed, 3 generations removed in the longest. If somebody was to live a longer life. Again, this is and I'm saying these things to just remind people how recent these ills are and how deeply these roots are into this country, and how for a lot of times, either longer than not, the country have dealt with some of these things, or areas of the country have dealt with some of these things. And again, it's a reminder of how every time there has been any type of change that has happened in this country, the legalities of the change have come after the consciousness of the society has changed, has come after the train of thought of the society has changed. That does not come before. The abolition of slavery in the North happened after the slaves that were in the North took it upon themselves to loot themselves and to emancipate themselves. It happened after Britain said that they were freeing slaves, and if you joined their army, you would be free. It happened after all the legal doctrine that said in paper and writing that slavery was ended in the North happened after all of these other social changes. And again, even once the legal change happened, and when it was put into paper, it was still years and decades after decades until it was fully implemented. And so again, that is why when people say things like, well, you should be trying to get legislation passed or get more people or get different people in office, that is why we have to continue to remind these people who have a false understanding of history that before people get into office and advocate for change, there's a change in the community, there's a change in the society, there's a change in the people. Before proper legislation is put into writing that advocates for actual change, there's a change in the consciousness, there's a change in the climate of the city, a change in the climate of counties, a change in the climate of states, a change in the climate of the country. The change in the climate does not come after legislation. It does not come after different type of politicians or more progressive politicians come into office. Politicians, as they are constituted and as they have always been constituted in this country, are people who do what is advantageous for them, do what will get them the most votes. And so you cannot depend on them to change the climate. You have to change the climate and force them to change their stances. And so let's continue. And as African slavery began to disappear from northern states, white people installed laws and practices discouraging free black people from settling there that, to the modern eye, look an awful lot like Jim Crow. These included disenfranchising black men, banning them from professional trades, and instituting harsher criminal sentencing for black people. All this happened against the backdrop of extensive vigilante white violence. Frederick Douglass, escaping bondage and settling as a free man in New Bedford, Massachusetts, was barred from practicing his highly skilled trade of caulking. Despite the flourishing shipbuilding business in this major whaling port, Douglass was forced into low-wage general laboring, and New Bedford was an abolitionist stronghold. As a result of these proto-Jim Crow practices, despite the fact that many Maroons would come to settle in the North, they were greatly outnumbered by white American birth rates and European settlers, and the percentage of the northern population that was black decreased by more than half between the signing of the Constitution in 1787 and the forming of the Confederacy in 1861. At the same time, the enslaved population in the South grew exponentially, particularly after the introduction of the cotton gin and the resulting cotton boom of the early 19th century. With the expansion of slavery to the South and West, and as America colonized Florida, the Louisiana territories, and Texas, fugitive routes to freedom increasingly pointed north. And one of the things that they have been speaking about in different portions of this book up to now has been how the many different routes that slaves were taking to escape. Florida was a place that they were speaking of being a haven. They were speaking of traveling west and trying to travel to Mexico as being a haven. They were speaking of traveling to where indigenous tribes were as being a haven. And they were speaking about how the North at a point in time had slavery, so the escape to the North was not as an alluring of an idea. And as time begins to progress and the North abolishes slavery, the American Revolution happens, and as America takes more control, as the settlers take more control of the indigenous land, and they take more control of Florida, and the Seminole Wars happen, it is not as advantageous for slaves to escape to Florida. It is not as advantageous for slaves to escape to the West and to other areas of the South, as slavery and Americanism spreads its toxins to the other areas of the land. And so the North becomes a more increasingly enticing place to escape to. And I think that, the hell they doing? And I think that that's an important thing to somebody over here looking at this memorial, making sure they ain't trying to do no crazy shit to it. And I think that that's an important thing to point out. To just go about showing how no area in this land is unscathed by slavery or colonialism. All right, let's continue. We're on top of page 51. Much as popular histories of the Black liberation movement of the 1960s often reduce it to MLK's dream, Rosa Parks, sit-ins, and freedom rides, the general sense of the antebellum abolition movement is as a largely white protest movement that mostly worked to change the hearts and minds of Northerners. It's true that propaganda campaigns, slave narratives, public rallies, and Northern organizing were crucial parts of the movement. But in the years leading up to the Civil War, it was a movement equally focused on militant direct action, whether through opposition to the fugitive slave laws or by the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was equally not some group of friendly white Quaker homeowners who helped fugitives by hiding them in their extra rooms. Though such people existed, they were a minority of the decentralized network of militants, many of them fugitives themselves, most of them black, who would come to be described by the umbrella term Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was extensive in the North, but it also led into Mexico, a western branch aided and organized in large part by indigenous tribes and displaced Seminole Maroons. This route became less viable, however, after the Compromise of 1850 made Texas an official slave state. Lacking any overarching organization, illegal from the very outset, from the early 19th century until the Civil War, the railroad laid its track all across the country. This widespread, horizontal group of freedom fighters was not a formal party or organization, but, as historian Eric Foner describes it, an, quote, interlocking series of local networks, end quote. The Underground Railroad is believed to have helped as many as 100,000 fugitives to freedom in the North, with thousands more escaping to Mexico. Underground Railroad stations stood as waypoints in a series of logistically and geographically distinct routes to freedom. The first station a fugitive might encounter, if they fled slavery by foot, was a home at border points between slave and free territory, such as on the northern banks of the Ohio River, where fugitives could hide out and wait for passage farther north. Their next stop might be facilitated by an urban, quote, vigilance committee, end quote. Vigilance committees were among the most important stations on the railroad and were set up as major hubs in cities such as Boston, New York, Oberlin, and Philadelphia. These small, local action committees sometimes comprised only a handful of people and were in constant need of funds. Nevertheless, the records furnish much of the surviving documentary history of the Underground Railroad. When things went easily, committee members would receive word from stations farther south or west and greet arriving fugitives as they landed. But they also scoured the neighborhoods around ports and train stations for apparent fugitives who had managed to gain access to transport out of the South and who had arrived alone or without a plan. Upon arriving in a free town or city, many fugitives described asking for help from the first black person they saw, who often directed them to the Vigilance Committee or a local station of the railroad. Though the records are obviously biased toward those who successfully found the committees, evidence still points to the fact that this knowledge was widely spread in free black communities. Urban black communities practiced mutual aid, protection, and self-defense. Abolitionist action was not only taken by those who considered themselves activists. The committees gave the fugitives shelter and food, investigated whether they were being hunted, and organized legal counsel if needed. They set up fugitives with work and housing locally if it was safe and the fugitive wanted to remain, or they bought them rail tickets or ship passage farther north. Fugitives frequently went on to Canada or to cities with a strong abolitionist community, such as New Bedford, where Frederick Douglass settled, which meant that they would be better protected from slave catchers. When they arrived, they were then helped by activists who organized work and housing for them and often reunited them with family or friends who may have been expecting them. We're on page 53, moving on to page 53, but I sort of want to talk about the idea that during this time, an escaped black person could be in the North, and the first black person that they would see, they would ask for help, and they would feel comfortable in asking them for help because of the solidarity that was in just being black. And of course, I'm sure that there are many escaped slaves that were burnt by this, who were burnt by black people who ended up being Uncle Toms and house Negroes and sellouts who took their vulnerability and used it to their own advantage for their own personal gains. But the reason what I want to emphasize is the reason in which that they would feel that they could trust the first black face they seen, and that was because the further back you go in American history, the closer together black people with black skin are tied to the fact that they have black skin, and that was something that was harder to escape the further back you go. We live here in 2021 where there's black police officers who will lock up a black person falsely just as quickly as a white police officer would. There are black police officers who would shoot an unarmed black person just as quickly as white police officers would, because classism has become involved in classism has become convoluted in racism. I'll say all the time that one of the reasons that during the Jim Crow era there could be so much of a strong solidarity with black people was because of the fact you could have a disagreement in the community about something, and the moment that you left the community, you were reminded of just how connected you were with your community and how much you were dependent on your community. When you have an argument or a fight with somebody in your black community about something that's frivolous or some type of material item, and then you wake up the next day and find out a black person's been lynched on the other side of town because they were on the wrong side of town too late at night, or what happened in Chicago multiple times where young black men would be killed for one time it was a young black man was killed for swimming in the river. They threw a rock at him and hit him, and he drowned and he died. And so you just were reminded, the further back you go, you were reminded so often of the fact that you were black, of the fact that you were descendants of slaves, of the fact that you were a slave, or the fact that people that looked like you were enslaved. And that reminding that happened so often formed such a strong sense of solidarity. And that is one of the things that the institution in this country realized. And so it began to, and it was already something that it did, the divide and conquer tactics, but it deepened this divide and conquer tactics, and it allowed for more tokenism, and it allowed to bring a few black people into the system to disrupt the strength of black people being in solidarity on the outside of the system. But that's just a quick thing that's just one of the things that came to mind as I was reading through that. But vigilance committees didn't just protect the newly emancipated. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 gave enslavers and their inheritors the permanent power to capture fugitives no matter how long the fugitive had been free. And because the evidence required was minimal, And even this tiny legal hurdle was cleared by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, under which law, as historian Nell Irvin Painter writes, quote, a slaveholder need merely swear that a particular black person was his slave, and appointed commissioners and federal marshals would seize the purported fugitive, end quote. Black people born free were frequently kidnapped under this law and sent into slavery. Vigilance committees would thus track the marshals and courts closely. With only 19th century communication technologies, they had to mobilize quickly because the legal proceedings to send a, quote, fugitive, end quote, south often lasted less than 24 hours from the moment the person was kidnapped by slave catchers. American courts can work quickly when that speed serves white supremacy. Even so, the committees often prevailed upon lawyers to delay proceedings long enough for the kidnapped person to escape to freedom, and sometimes crowds gathered and physically attempted to free them from marshals and enslavers. These slave-freeing riots, these lootings, though they didn't always succeed, happened frequently enough in Manhattan to be a major impetus in the creation of the New York City Police Department. This entire, quote, railroad journey, end quote, was done with great speed, seriousness, and secrecy under the constant threat of danger and violence. When it went smoothly, it appeared a simple logistical procedure, but assisting fugitives was a federal crime, and Underground Railroad militants were the declared enemies of the enslavers and the state. Many were jailed, re-enslaved, or killed. No role in the Underground Railroad was more dangerous than that of, quote, conductor, end quote, however. Many of those souls who organized raids into the hearts of slave country itself, free men and women who led military incursions into hostile territory to help free the enslaved, never came back. And no conductor is so widely known as Harriet Tubman. Tubman was recognized as a great leader, referred to by the enslaved and free alike as, quote, Moses, end quote, an important and powerful designation in a time and among a population, as many have noted, that thought quite literally and directly in biblical references. But even during her life, white supporters described Tubman as, quote, superhuman, end quote, as somehow fundamentally different from other ex-slaves. As biographer Butch Lee writes, quote, this made her less dangerous to them, easier to handle, less awesome. After all, picture a nation of Harriet Tubmans, end quote. Indeed, just as bourgeois history uses the most visible and famous movement leaders to obscure the great masses who make their leadership possible and legible, so does Harriet Tubman's heightened visibility serve to hide the thousands of operatives who ventured into slave territory every year to free slaves. As J. Sakai writes, quote, in 1860, we know that 500 underground organizers went into the South from Canada alone, end quote. Harriet Tubman was only the most famous of a generation of militant warriors who fought for the total overturning of slavery by any means necessary. She lived a life of direct action. Born into slavery, Tubman never learned to read, but she became a brilliant military tactician. She planned and carried out 19 separate raids into slave territory, usually going twice a year, often on foot, without ever being caught. One of her major strategic insights was to continue moving south from distance with the newly fugitive before heading north, because enslavers never suspected groups would head deeper into slave territory. Tubman bore a massive bounty on her head until the fall of slavery. She was the most wanted and hated woman in the South. Tubman falling ill delayed John Brown, who called her, quote, General Tubman, end quote, from attempting to loot the armory at Harper's Ferry on the planned date of July 4th, 1859. Had she been present when Brown carried out their plan on October 16th, 1859, some have argued she would have prevented Brown from making the tactical blunders, most notably allowing a mail train to leave Harper's Ferry and thus bringing news of the raid to the federal government, that led to his becoming a martyr and symbol rather than a victorious freedom fighter. And had Tubman and Brown's raid succeeded, the terms of the Civil War might not have been set by the slavocracy succession, but rather by a revolutionary slave army, as Terry Besson imagines in his speculative historical novel, Fire on the Mountain. But much as the enslaved have been removed from the narrative of their own liberation, Tubman is erased from or made a footnote in the popular history of John Brown's raid. So, too, is her role and the role of the enslaved in general during the combat of the Civil War. Tubman is known as a spy for the Union Army, but again, this is individualized and taken out of context. She is seen as a, quote, lone superwoman spy for the white man's army, end quote, when instead she organized an intelligence network of river plots, black scouts, and slaves that kept the Union Army informed of enemy movements. Indeed, the importance to the Union effort of Maroon intelligence and knowledge, both of local terrain and Confederate movements, cannot be overemphasized. Let's see. Let's keep running. I'm gonna run through the rest of this the rest of this section, and then we'll sort of reflect on this portion here. There's a lot of things I want to touch on, but let's keep going. Let's keep going. In Tubman's most dramatic military action, the Combahee River Raid is sometimes left out of popular histories altogether. In June 1863, during the height of Civil War combat, Tubman guided 300 black soldiers up the Combahee River in the middle of the night, deep into South Carolina plantation country. As a reporter's dispatch at the time described it, they, quote, struck a bold and effective blow, destroying millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton, and lordly dwellings, and striking terror into the heart of rebeldom. Brought off near 800 slaves and thousands of dollars worth of property without losing a man or receiving a scratch, end quote. They set fire to 4 plantations and 6 mills and looted property and slaves from wealthy Confederates. Such an act, within the context of war, was celebrated by white supporters of the Union Army. But had it been carried out under, quote, peaceful circumstances, end quote, would it have been celebrated or seen as an act of violent looting, rioting, arson, and rebellion? The reaction to John Brown's failed raid only 4 years earlier gives us our answer. The U.S. Senate set up a committee to prosecute anyone who had aided Brown. Abraham Lincoln called him, quote, insane, and many liberal white abolitionists reacted with shock and outrage against his violent methods. It is only the 20/20 hindsight of history, a vision corrected by the actions of the enslaved, that allows us to see property and human beings as the evil it was. At the time, it was as natural as the prisons and police are today. Only the thousands of abolitionists like Tubman, the millions of enslaved who rose up in revolt, flight, and strike, who overthrew the system of slavery, have allowed us to see slavery clearly. And then there's a break before we move on to the next portion here. And again, we are reading In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweil, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action. And we just sort of finished reading about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, and it was so one of the things I want to harp on. Well, there's multiple things I want to sort of harken back on, but I want to point out how the importance of black women in American history, in the United States, and the history of the United States of America. And there's not just as there is no moment in American history in which black liberation has not led to the furthering of the ideals of America, there's no moment in the black liberation history in which black women have not been at the forefront in manifesting the ideals of black liberation and manifesting the ideals of black revolution. I think that is something that is not as much as black history is not taught properly in American schools and is not given the proper historical precedent that it should have. Black women in the midst of American history, in the midst of I don't want to say just black history, but black women in the midst of American history are not given their just due, are not put in the proper context. And even here in the movement, in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice which has taken place, there has not been a moment in which there were not black women at the forefront of it. In which there were not black women who were vocal about these issues, in which there were not black women who were not the loudest voices, and we're not doing the carrying the brunt of the work in the brunt of the burden in the struggle. And so I think that's something that needs to be that we have to readjust and that we have to change, and that is giving black women their just due in this struggle. And in the same way that one of the reasons we must give them their just due, and one of the reasons we must highlight the things that they have done and the work that they have done, is because it will not be without black women that we will get further along. Only with the same type of opportunities, with more opportunities for black women to be vocal, for black women to put their imprint on this struggle, will we advance further in the struggle. And so that's one of the things that I was thinking about as I was going through, and they were reading about Harriet Tubman and the strength of Harriet Tubman. I think one of the other things that sort of came to mind is how often that it is the idea of individualism. I can't remember who I heard this from, but they spoke about how the number one thing that one of the main things capitalism thrives upon is individualism. One of the main things that Americanism thrives upon, again, is the concept of individualism. And we need to get closer to the concept of collectivism for us to be able to properly combat the evils of Americanism. We must get stronger to collectivism for us to properly combat the negatives of capitalism. And the same thing goes for racism. One of the number one one of the number one weapons of racism has been individualism as opposed to collectivism. It's the reason why token integrationism has been used. It's the idea that they will take an individual black person, and this individual black person can become part of the American system, or this individual black person can rise above oppression or rise above exploitation in some sense. But that individual black person cannot spread that to the collective of black people. You must leave the group or the collective of black people to benefit from the individual tokenism. It's the idea that it's the idea of slowly implementing the integration of schools, where you take 5 at a time, or you take 20 at a time, or 30 at a time. And so it is not the collective of black people who get the benefits of integration happening, as opposed to it being being the collective of black people benefiting from it. I think I messed that up, but I think that the point should be getting across there. And so when they sort of highlight Harriet Tubman more than they highlight the thousands of other black conductors, even though that is good that a black woman is being given her just due and being given some of the credit she deserves. It cannot be at the expense of the rest of the other black women who also engaged in these things. That's something that people speak about with Rosa Parks all the time, that it was multiple black women who, before Rosa Parks, refused to give up their seat. And I hate that I'm drawing a blank on their names right now. But one young woman, she refused to give up her seat. But because they found out she was pregnant, they decided to not go ahead with her in the lawsuit. But she had that same courage as Rosa Parks. She was part of the domino effect of the NAACP and Dr. King beginning the boycott in Montgomery. And so even though we do an injustice to black women collectively if we do not give Rosa Parks the just due that she deserves, and if we do not give Harriet Tubman the just due that they deserve in American history, we also do a disservice to black women collectively if we give more than should be more not attention, but more onus on Rosa Parks or Harriet Tubman than should be given. We must use them as a conduit to explaining how multiple black women were Harriet Tubmans and multiple black women were Rosa Parks. And they sort of spoke on that, how in here when they spoke about how they went to this effort to make make Harriet Tubman seem to be superhuman, because then it meant that it couldn't be a whole bunch of other black women like Harriet Tubman's. It wasn't a whole nation of Harriet Tubman's. And when the fact is that it was a nation of Harriet Tubman's, it was a host of other black women with the same attitude and the same fearlessness that Harriet Tubman had. And so those are some of the thoughts that come to mind. I think also the deeper education that needs to come along with the history of slavery in this country, and just all the nuances that came with it, and exactly what the struggle to end slavery was like. I think that that's one of the things that's being painted very well in here, and I think we've read other books that have painted the struggle against Jim Crow and Jim Crow justice and the segregation very well, and to just lay out the nuances so that way people don't think that all of a sudden it was slavery, then it was the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and no slavery. So let's continue. Okay, on page 56. When the soon-to-be Confederate States withdrew from the Union, starting with South Carolina on December 20th, 1860, they did so ostensibly in response to the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was the presidential candidate of the 6-year-old Republican Party, which had formed out of the ashes of a number of political parties, the Whigs, the Know-Nothings, and the northern half of the Democrats, all of whose national bases had fractured during the 1850s over the question of slavery. But the southern states that rose in reactionary secession against the United States did not do so because Lincoln threatened to end slavery, but because he intended to keep it from spreading it into the new territories of the American West. The general strike of the enslaved meant that the Civil War would become a struggle over the existence of slavery, but up until their great revolt, the total and immediate abolition of slavery was an extreme and unpopular political vision. Beyond the enslaved themselves, it was held mostly by freeborn black people, ex-slaves, maroons, and a tiny handful of radical whites who had joined the abolitionist movement. The mainstream political battles over slavery in the 1850s were rather between the plantation class, who wanted slavery to expand into the territories of the West, and those who wanted the Western territories to join the Union as, quote, free soil, end quote. And I think that that's important to point out because, again, it's the nuances that are used. There's a saying that says the devil is in the details. And I believe that that is very true about America. It's the devil is in the details about just how deeply the evils of racism are in this country, and the evils of capitalism are in this country, and the evils of classism are in this country. And so we see here at the onset of what would become this Civil War that it is not the ending of slavery that is the fight that is being had against basically white Americans, because we know where black Americans stood on this, or Africans stood on this. It is the fight over slavery expanding into another area of the country that is being fought over. Not the ending of it overall, but the continued spreading of it. And so, again, that's something that they're not telling you. When they speak about Abraham Lincoln, they don't tell you that. When they speak about, when they educate these children on the Civil War in these history classes, they're not telling them these things because of the image that it gives the nation. The plantation owners, with pretensions of being European gentlemen, believed they were creating a new world historical slave empire and cultural center akin to Rome or Greece. To prove this, they spent money well beyond their means, imagining elaborate displays of conspicuous consumption and architectural splendor made them akin to European aristocrats. The massive chronic debt thus accumulated, perhaps the main attribute they really shared with 19th century European nobility, combined with increasing market pressures, meant that they needed to expand available plantation territory to increase their profits. They looked hungrily toward Mexico, which then included much of today's southwestern United States, California, and the Caribbean, where they saw the promise of endless plantations filled with African laborers. They rejected the northern model of development, believing that the industrialist production of a professional middle class would mean less wealth accumulation at the top, and that, furthermore, reliance on a massive white proletariat promised class war from the bottom. The Free Soil movement, for its part, represented a cross-class alliance, though it included abolitionists, was mostly made up of northern capitalists, merchants, recent European immigrants, and organized labor. Capitalists looked to Haiti with horror and believed that it was slavery that produced unmanageably rebellious subjects. Some of America's first NIMBYists, they wanted to keep profiting off of the plantation slavery as it existed, restrained to the South, but to use the, quote, new, end quote, territory for mixed agricultural and industrial development carried out by a predominantly immigrant white settler workforce. The workers, who wanted to settle the land as homesteaders, joined them in this white supremacist vision. The expansion of slavery plantations across the territory would leave no space for them to homestead. Furthermore, just like racist anti-immigrant rhetoric holds today, many white workers and organized labor unions of the antebellum period believed that the mere presence of black workers, enslaved or free, drove down wages. And so it's in this portion here that I think it's important to speak about how as they're making plans for this land that is occupied by people. They're making plans for this land that are already people's homes, that have people's cultures and have people's have history of people in them. They're making plans for what they're going to do when they conquer them. Again, this just lets you know the levels that colonialism exists in. That they not only are they trying to decide whether or not to continue slavery in this land. They're deciding what to do and what not to do with this land that, again, is not uninhabited. This is not land that they have truly discovered that there aren't people in. This is land that is inhabited. This is land. What up, brother? Be safe out here. This is land that is that people have for generations have lived on, and what they are planning to do is to continue their genocide of the indigenous people and to continue their looting of land, their looting of resources. And again, so when you think about the fact that earlier in this chapter we read how Abraham Lincoln spoke ill of John Brown for the looting of slaves and the destruction of some of the plantation and things of that nature. Meanwhile, in the same nation, they are preparing to go and loot the indigenous land, go and steal the resources from the indigenous people of this nation. Hold on, this water bottle. Hold on, I'm gonna throw this water bottle away. 1 second. All right. All right, let's keep it pushing. Okay, so we are on page. We're on page 57. Page 57. Okay. The Free Soil movement, for its part. Okay, I already read through that. My fault. We on the next page. We on page 58. My fault. Top of page 58. Neither side saw any problem with the fact that these territories were to be added to the United States by the violent conquest of their indigenous residents, many of them already multiplied, displaced by America's genocidal expansion. The political conflict around slavery that precipitated the Civil Wars was, in other words, between two different white supremacists, pro-slavery settler colonialist visions of America's future. And so again, they're just pointing out there how when we talk about these, the struggle that was going on about the expansion of slavery to the West and what to do in the West, we must remember that these were two white supremacist ideologies at war. White supremacist ideology that wanted to put a focus on slavery and the continuing of slavery, and a white supremacist ideology that wanted to put an emphasis on the colonization but both of them are white supremacist ideologies. And again, that gives us back to this idea of the lesser of two evils being presented to people of color in this nation on a regular basis. In this moment, you had to pick between the white supremacist ideology of the colonialist, or the the settler colonialist, or the white supremacist ideology of the pro-slavery people. And again, it's the lesser of two evils. It's picking your poison. Let's continue. Throughout this period, all branches of the federal government remained steadfastly pro-slavery. Congress passed a series of bills making up the Compromise of 1850, which, along with the enacting the Fugitive Slave Act, guaranteed that slave states would retain their disproportionate power in the federal government. That compromise was the diplomatic coup of the moderate liberal president Millard Fillmore, but such mealy-mouthed liberal white supremacy would give way in 1853 to a fiercely pro-slavery executive branch led by Democratic President Franklin Pierce. Pierce shepherded the disastrous Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress, an act that would overturn federal restrictions on slavery's expansion and lead to the first stage of the Civil War, when guerrilla combat between enslavers and abolitionists exploded in Kansas. Not to be outdone by the other branches of government, the Supreme Court in 1857 issued the Dred Scott decision, which ruled that black people had never been allowed to be, nor ever could be, American citizens, that Congress was constitutionally unable to ban slavery in the territories, and that the federal government had no legal grounds to free slaves whatsoever. And again, this just is a highlighting of how in the midst of 1850 and 1857, these pivotal moments in American history, these pivotal moments, whether they be in the legislative branch, or whether they be in the judicial branch. I think I'm getting that right. Whether it be through, the executive branch, whether it be through the executive branch or the judicial branch, the federal government, as the consciousness of the people in the nation was becoming more and more anti-slavery, whether that be the slaves themselves or people who felt that slavery was bad for the business of colonization, or whether that be freeborn black people in the North that didn't want slavery to continue, or whether it be escaped ex-slaves in the North that wanted slavery to discontinue. The consciousness of the country was getting more and more against slavery. But as that was happening, the government was tightening up more and more on slavery, and there was an ebb and flow of different politicians gaining office on these issues. And again, I'm saying this and pointing these, and the Dred Scott decision is coming down. And I'm saying these things for multiple reasons, for two reasons. One of the reasons I'm saying these things is because it should be highlighted just how much this country struggles against change, and how often this country has been on the wrong side of history when it comes to issues of humanity. And then secondly, to point out how just how deeply ingrained into this country racism truthfully is, where in 1857, we're getting closer and closer to current times. Where in 1857, the Supreme Court said that black people had never been allowed to be American citizens, that black people never could become American citizens, that never could become American citizens. That means in 1857, when they made that decision, they was thinking about 1957, they was thinking about 2057, 2157, and they said never could black people be allowed to become American citizens. They said that Congress was constitutionally unable to ban slavery in the territories, which, if you think about what the 13th Amendment came to represent, there is still slavery. If you are arrested and imprisoned legally in this country, you are under enslavement and can be under enslavement. So even though they were speaking about the expansion and how slavery couldn't be banned out in the expansion, that still has some type of correlation to where we stand at today, because even today, slavery has not been completely wiped out in this nation and wiped out in the territories. And that the federal government had no legal ground to free slaves whatsoever. That's the type of country that this is. So when they say make America great again, that's what they talking about. They talking about 1857. But this strong governmental support for slavery, driven by Southern Democrats, wasn't enough for the constantly anxious plantation class who feared that the actual unification of free soilers within a single political party, the Republicans, threatened their goals and their future power in Washington. Still, Lincoln's election was more pretense than cause. Tubman and Brown's insurrection had flared up only a year previously. In October 1859, and combined with the constantly growing movement of fugitives, reaching 50,000 Maroons per annum by 1860, and the always increasing, quote, disorder, end quote, among urban communities of enslaved black workers, insurgency seemed a much more immediate threat to slavery's existence than Abraham Lincoln. The planners believed they would be better armed legally and normatively to repress slave uprisings if they didn't have to confer with the North that just didn't understand the necessities of their peculiar institution. Slavery was simultaneously more successful than it had ever been. The cotton crop of 1859 was almost twice the size of that of 1850, and more facing more organized, concerted limits than ever before. Southern plantation owners believed they would not be able to compete politically or economically forever without the expansion of slavery's territory, and they believed that this was a fortuitous moment to force the issue. Arrogant in the face of their legislative successes, the planters overestimated their power and their popular support, and so the enslavers made their great historical gambit, counter-revolution by secession, and sealed their fate as a doomed class. Okay, I'm going to give a sort of a rundown of, I love how this chapter is sort of progressing. We on page 59, we got 10 pages left. I'm probably actually going to start the Rockford reading over with, but I got to go use the bathroom. But before I do that, I'm going to stop here on page 59 because I do want to finish this chapter up today. And I want to just reflect on some of the things that we just read. I want to say this. This has been something that as I continue to read, I've thought and I haven't vocalized yet. But one of the things that is very eye-opening and enlightening to me as I go through and read this is how much the slaves revolting themselves, how much of a factor that had on things that were going on in the South, on the political decisions that were making in the South. One of the things that in the portion that we just read, one of the things that Vicky speaks about as another straw to break the camel back of leading to secession is that the South felt the North didn't understand the nuances of slavery. The South didn't understand the things that they needed to continue slavery, and one of those things being they didn't understand the fear that they were in of an insurgents of the slave rebellion. And again, I think that's important to point out because they speak about what John Brown was beginning to do, what Harriet Tubman was beginning to do, what the Underground Railroad was doing. It spoke about Haiti, spoke about Nat Turner, and all of these things become fears of the power structure. It becomes fears of these institutions, and so they were trying to find ways to combat those things. But I think that simultaneously, those actions all led to a heightening the consciousness of the entire society that not only how immoral was slavery and how wrong slavery was, but also the dangers that came along with slavery and the fear that they could become victims of this evil that they were permitting or permeating or pushing out to the society. And so again, that's just one of those things where it's pointed out how the people who are the victims of oppression, the victims of exploitation, the victims of injustice, how it begins with them fighting back. It's not just enough to understand it. It's not just enough to speak out against it. It has to begin to be a struggle. It has to begin to be a fight back. It has to begin. You have to make these institutions make moves that are counter to your moves, and that is what the slaves in the South, the slaves in America did. That is what the black people in America did. That is what the portion of goodwill whites who were abolitionists did. They forced political mayhem and political melee. They forced social mayhem and social melee. And in the midst of doing that, in the midst of not allowing it to be peaceful slavery, in the midst of forcing it to be slavery with tension, it led to them finding the route to ending chattel slavery. And so I gotta go run use the bathroom. I do want to knock these last 10 pages out, so I'm gonna end this live, and I'm probably gonna come back and start another Rockford reading, and we gonna try to get through chapter 2 of In Defense of Looting. I've been trying to do a chapter a day, and I'm a little bit behind on that, so I'm gonna try to make up for that today. We outside. Oh, hold on, gotta do this right. Justice for Demetrius Bennett, justice for Mark Barmore, justice for Jovan Fresco, justice for Eddie Patterson, justice for Geno Washington, justice for Logan Bell, justice for Kerry Blake, justice for Joseph McCormick, justice for Lil Mike Sago, justice for Mikey Guzman, justice for Faustin Guaitigo, justice for Shannon Graves, justice for Philip Johnson, justice for Jasper Banks, justice for Suzette Babler. We outside.